I think I'm the first non-MVP speaker today, so fairly esteemed company, and slightly challenging to be here. So hopefully I'll live up to the expectations of everybody else. I've been working with the platform with Dynamics primarily for about 8 or 9 years now. So worked on every version from CRM 2011 right through to the latest version of Dynamics 365, and I've worked both on premise and online. I currently work for a financial services company based in Edinburgh, and obviously, as you can tell by my accent, I'm very Scottish. So just a slight kind of bit of forewarning, I do get quite excited when I speak, and I tend to speak a little bit quickly. So if you do find me speaking quickly, just give me a shout and I'll try and slow down for you. My main focus really is on developing nowhere low code solutions, and I know the kind of whole no code low code thing can kind of ruffle some feathers, but really it's about developing simple, scalable solutions for people that end users can put in place, because that's where I came from. My background is I did law at university, um, and then I did IT law at master's level, and then I was working for a company in the oil and gas industry who had Dynamics and didn't really know what they were doing with it. And I've just always been a massive geek, so I fell into using it, and kind of over time I've developed that into my career to the point where I'm now a kind of full-time functional consultant in-house. On the slide, I've obviously put my socials. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and I also blog relatively frequently as well. So you can follow my blog. All of the content from this presentation is on my blog, and I'll pop a link to that at the end, and I'll make sure it's in the chat. But hopefully it makes sense. And so the agenda today is really pretty straightforward. What I'm going to show is how we create HTML tables. So doing the kind of basic version of how we create a simple HTML table, going through to an intermediate version where we'll add a bit of kind of internal CSS styling, and then we'll move on finally to an advanced one where we'll really go into the detail of using inline CSS. And I'll explain what I mean by those as we go through this process. And the scenario that I'm going with here is that in my Dynamics or my CDS environment, I'll have a quote that has a number of quote lines. I want to be able to take those along with the totals information and email that to my client. And so I'll show that and as to how we've got it, and then I'll get it in place. So the first thing is when we're creating a simple HTML table, there's just a couple of key actions. So one is we're going to list records to retrieve quote details. Then we'll use the select action to select the key information, and then we'll use the create HTML table action to create our table. And it's all going to be pretty much live demos. I have made my sacrifices to the demo gods, so hopefully everything works. It's all worked as I've been through it this morning, so fingers crossed. So let's just jump straight into the demo first. So as I said, I've got a quote here in my system, and you can see I've got a list of products, quote products in here with some key information. So what I want to do is create a table that has all of this information, and I also want to include this information within my email and then get it sent. And I've just set it to run on a trigger field here, but obviously you could use whatever triggers you want. So if we jump into the flow, the first thing is we're going to use the CDS current environment connector, which Antti kind of covered earlier. So the key thing you can see here is I've put my filter and attributes. Ignore the fact that I've started it with new underscore. We'll just ignore that and pretend I did proper solution management. But we've got this filter and attribute, and I'm just saying only run this flow when that filter equals true. The next step is I'm then going to use a list record step, and I'm using the OData query to say when that quote ID value is the same as the GUID from my triggering quote. And if you've ever used the list record step and actually looked at what's returned, it looks something like this, which if you're like me and not from an IT background, it can be slightly overwhelming. You're like, oh my God, there's just so much here. So what I want to be able to do is pick the key information from this rather than trying to make sense of all this. And that's where the select action becomes so useful and will be your best friend. And so select basically allows you to create what it calls key value pairings. And so if you think about this from a table perspective, because that's how we're working, I guess, is in my head, the key column is your table headers, and the value column is your row data. So I want a table that has product, price per unit, quantity, discount, and extended amount as my headers. And then for each product that I'm returning, I want that value. And so when I look through the JSON here, what you'll see is it's going to pull out, for example, the quantity and the extended amount and the price per unit, etc., etc. And then we use the create HTML table action, which takes the output from above. And because we've already set the key pairings, we can just set the columns to automatic. So we don't need to create anything else. We don't need to use any parse JSON or anything like that. It's really simple. So to create a table, it's 3 steps. List your records, use a select, create HTML table. And then I'm just going to send it in an email. So I'm just going to say, hey, thanks for your interest. I'm going to pop the table HTML in here. And then because I wanted that additional detail from my quote in here, I'll just add that down in the bottom of the email. And so what that ends up looking like is we get an email through that looks a little bit like this. So we can see we've got it in, it's taken all of those products and the key information from there, and it's popped it in, and it's given us the detailed information at the bottom. So far, so good, relatively speaking, I guess. And we'll just jump back into the presentation in 1 second. So what are the pros with that? So one is it's really simple to set up. Anybody can do that. I've managed to do that really quickly. And if I'd been doing that live, I could have set it up in about 5 minutes. We can deliver the data we want with minimum fuss. It's just in there and it works fine and it looks great. I guess the downside to that is there's no formatting options. I'll jump back to the table in a second, but you'll see it looks pretty plain. There's no borders around it. There's no kind of key format, and the numbers are all just formatted as general kind of integer decimal values. And so from a user experience point of view, user interface, it's not ideal. I find that if I was to present that to anybody, they're going to complain to me really quickly and say, do you know what, Ryan, that's good, but actually we want to do a bit more styling on that. And so that's how we do that. So we're going to jump in to the next demo, which is where we do internal CSS styling. And so the only difference with this is it's almost the exact same as the previous step. I'm just adding a compose action at the end, and where I'll add my CSS styling. So when we talk about styling HTML with CSS, there's 3 ways you can add HTML elements to, you can add CSS to your HTML. So one is using an external style sheet. And this is something if you are generating lots of HTML tables and lots of different flows, rather than hard coding that and having to then unpick that and make sure you brand them all separately. You could have a style sheet linked in one for your brand, and so any updates that will cascade through your flows, and you would use that with a link tag in your HTML. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to focus on using an internal CSS style. And so that we do that by using a style element in the head section of the HTML. And then the third way we can do HTML styling is to use inline styling by using style attributes and HTML elements. If you're not familiar with HTML or CSS, what I've done at the bottom here is I've just included a few links to W3 Schools, which is a free web resource that covers everything you could ever want to know and more about HTML or CSS, as well as many other things. I've used that extensively. They've got little try it editors that you can run and you can test with it. So like I say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can use internal CSS to add a little bit of extra style to our table and make it just look just that little bit nicer. And then I'll explain a bit about the pros and cons of that. So again, we're going to jump back to the demo. So if I go to this one, so what you'll see is it's the exact same setup. I'm using the same when a record is updated, when my quote's updated, I'm using the same list record step with that filter query. I'm using the same select action to get the information, and then I'm creating that HTML table. And then the last piece is what I'm really doing here is I'm adding some style elements. And if you're not familiar with CSS, this can look terrifying. I totally appreciate it. So fortunately for me, I never had to write this. Although I am familiar with CSS, I appreciate nobody is. So what I've got is there's a website called divtable.com, which allows you to generate some table styles. And so I just picked one here. So let's pick the default one. And you can see here, I can say, well, what size of border do I want? I can put a big border around it if I want to. I can set a background color. I can set some padding elements in it and do all the rest of this. I can set my widths to be like 100% or a fixed number of pixels. I can set the border collapsed or not collapsed. And I can change some font details and whatever else. And so what it generates on the right-hand side here is this CSS list that we have. One of the things you will note with this is it's got these horizontal stripes. Unfortunately, when we're putting these internal CSS, that doesn't translate across Outlook or most email clients, because the way it works is it uses this first child element, and I'm not quite sure why, but it's a fairly simplified version of CSS that's supported by email clients. So that doesn't work. Oh, excuse me, my cat's decided to get involved here. So I'll explain in the next step how we can work around that. But we can take all of the key information from here and we can copy it out. And so one of the first things to notice if you do go and use this is it adds this kind of dot blue table. So you'll need to remove all of those elements because we're not using any specific classes for this. It just refers to the class that you have. So we're just saying I just want all tables. So you would just copy this out, remove any reference to dot blue table, and then you'll be able to paste that in to your style header. So again, this link, I'll pop it in the bottom. I do have a link to my blog, but it's a great way to kind of to get up and running very quickly as to how you want to style. And if anything like me, I'm not very style focused. I'm very, clearly not a very stylish guy. So I don't really, I can't pick the best colors all the time. So I use this to kind of to give me some ideas, and then I can pop it in. And so yeah, it's nice and straightforward. So once we've got that, we pop it in the style tags, and then we pop our output from the create HTML table, which just generates that HTML file at the bottom. And probably what I should have done there is if I just go to test on this one, it show you what the output from the HTML table actually looks like when my flow runs. There we go. So when you generate your HTML, although it gives you this kind of nice looking body here, what you end up getting is your kind of table. If I yeah, so this is how your table HTML actually looks as the output from that step. And what we're saying here is we're going to add a style and a close style tag just above that because it's within the HTML elements. And then, same as before, we're going to send this email that does the same thing. It takes that output from this step here, including those style tags, and we'll put the same details in the bottom. So we can test this. It'll take a second to run and generate it, and then my emails come in. So if I go to my intermediate one, what you can see immediately is this is so much nicer to look at. We've got a nice kind of clear bolded header. We've got the information into kind of clear columns with our row and column dividers. And so from a user point of view, if you just look at that difference, it's night and day really. It's so much easier for a user to get to grips with. They're going to understand it a lot more. They're going to appreciate it a lot more. I definitely think it's something they're going to be like, oh, actually, this is much nicer for us to use. So jumping back to my slides just a second. So what are the pros and cons of using that internal CSS? So one is it's easy to implement again. You can see, all I've done is I've gone to that website, div table, to get some styling. I've copied it across, made some minor tweaks to it, and immediately been able to add some kind of nice styling elements to my tables. And it allows you for much better styling options. You can implement different fonts or different styles, different font sizes. You can do lots of really cool and interesting bits and pieces. And so from your end user point of view, that user experience is improved significantly. I definitely think that's something that they will massively appreciate. They'll say, they'll totally be blown away by it in my experience. Some of the downsides to it, your advanced formatting options are fairly limited, and you can't include that data from multiple sources. And what I mean by that is this stuff at the bottom is still not in the table. I would prefer if this was all part of one table. I think that presents a lot nicer to your users. And so I'd much rather, from my point of view, be able to have all of this stuff in one table. So I don't want to have multiple HTML table elements and try and work out a way to combine them. It would just be nicer if I had a single table because that makes more sense to my my users. And so what I'll show you now is how we can do that with some manual HTML generation. Oh, there we go. So when we're talking about advanced HTML table styling, we're not going to be using that create HTML table action because it's too simple for us. And so what we want to be able to do is to have much more granular control over what each row or each column might look like and what each table element. So there's a couple of key actions we're going to be using in this. We're going to be using variables. I know that Serge talked about not using variables before, so hopefully he'll forgive me here. We're still going to use that list records, but we're going to be using an apply to each loop. And although we're using apply to each, unless you're generating a table that has, tens of thousands of rows, although it'll be slightly slower, in my experience, it's not going to matter that much. Most people don't necessarily need these things to run, super real time. As long as it's quick-ish, then that'll be fine. Obviously, in different scenarios, you might want to do something else. And I talked before about using this inline CSS styling, and I'll jump into that in just a second. But before we get into defining the HTML table, it's probably important to consider how HTML tables are structured. And again, if you're not from HTML background, then hopefully this will make a bit of sense. But HTML always has stuff enclosed in these tags, so the kind of less than greater than elements. So you start with your table, so you'd have a open table, end table at the kind of top and bottom of it, and so your table is defined within that. And then underneath that, you can break that down into your head, body, and foot elements. So you can have those elements broken out. And this is really important because it allows us to define styling for those elements as a collective group, although we can then go down even further than that. Each table row, so each row in your table is defined with a TR tag. And then if you've got header cells, you can define those with this TH tag. And the default style in those is they're bolded and centered, but we can then apply specific styling elements to table header cells versus other cells. And your other table cells are defined with this TD tag. And again, where I talked about the W3 schools link, I'll pop it back in again, but you'll be able to see that. And what I've done here is tried to break that down in a way that hopefully makes sense. So you can see on the left-hand side here, this is what a typical table HTML would look like. So you can see we've got the open table, closed table. We have the open head and close head to give us a heading setting, and the open body and closed body to give us the body setting. We then have a row for the header. So although it's a header row, it still uses the same logic as this TR, close TR, and then individual cells are within these TH brackets. And then we're going to the body of it, we've got row 1, row 2, and then it's cell 1, cell 2, cell 1, cell 2. And again, just trying to make this visual because I work very visually and hopefully this makes sense. So you can see here the overall table is enclosed in this table tag. The header itself is enclosed in the heading tag with each individual cell within the TH tag. Then your body has your kind of in your T body structure. And this is important because when you're writing CSS styling, you can specifically break this out. Your TR covers each individual row, so each row will be within a set of TR tags, and then each cell will be in a set of TD tags. Does that make sense? Has anybody got any questions on that before I jump into the next kind of complicated bit? Nope. Good. I can't see any questions, Daniel, so because my PowerPoint's killing my screen here, but if anybody does any questions, can you just give me a shout? So we're going to go into the demo again, and this one is slightly more complicated for the advanced. So the first one, the first element, I guess, to consider here is the getting the same as before. We're getting the record using the same trigger as before, the exact same, and the same list record step. And that's where the similarities between this and the previous two steps stop. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to initialize a row number, and I'm going to use that to go through my apply to each, because that'll help me identify whether we're in an even or odd row, because I want to apply different formatting to those different rows. Then I'm going to initialize my table HTML. So I'm just going to generate the HTML manually. And this is where I was talking about creating your table. So you can see I've started with the open table. I've added some style in here. And so where I talked about that CSS, if I jump back to here, I'm going to take, instead of it being all within a style sheet, you can put it in line in the CSS. So you can say, actually, I want to have that in this line. I want the line or the element to have this specific styling. So you can see here where this table element would apply to the whole table. In here, I'm just putting it in line in here, and it'll do the exact same thing. But obviously, as you can see, we've got it here. So the reason CSS style sheets are kind of kept separately is because I guess it's maybe slightly easier. But I'm saying I want a kind of bold border around the table. I want it to be black. I want my borders to be collapsed and have a width of 1, and I want to have cell padding of 2. Then in my table header, I want to make sure it's left aligned rather than center aligned. I'm setting a background color. I'm putting a thick border underneath the table header section. That's going to be black. I'm going to make the font size large, and I want to make it bold. So I want to have kind of a nice big bold header, and I want that to be black or white, sorry. And then I'm setting the width of each column specifically. So I'm saying I want those columns to have a specific pixel value that I want. And again, I'm just setting those headers. So, if I was to jump back to here, I've set, the same as when I set the headers in the select action. I'm doing the same thing here. It's just that they're hard coded into the section. So all this initialize HTML action is doing is it's taking we're opening the styling for the table, and we're generating the headers with fixed values, and we're generating all of that CSS in there. And then we close the table header, and then we open the table body bit. And so the reason I've added the table body tag in here is because I want each of the, rather than having kind of nested if conditions, to say, if this is the first one, then do this or whatever, it's easier just to say, you know what, we'll have it in here, and then we can add all the body, and then we'll close the body in this section here. So what I'm doing after that is I'm taking, for each returned record that I've listed here, I'm going to increment my row number variable that I initialized up here by 1. And then, excuse me, I'm going to append some information to that table HTML that we generated here. So the first thing, like I said, is the reason I've got this row number is I want to say if it's an even number, then I want to have one color for background, and if it's not, I want to have a different color background. So because we can't use that nth child or nth child even CSS tag, we do it this way. And so the way that works, I don't know how visible that is for everybody, but what we're saying here is if the mod output of the row number variable divided by 2 is equal to 0, then set the background to be white. Otherwise, set it to be this grey color. And the reason I'm using mod there is because if we go jump into the reference guide, yeah, so mod returns the remainder from dividing two numbers. So you can get the integer result by using the div function, but mod's this kind of flip side of it that says whatever's left after the integer, give us that instead. So if you take any number and divide it by 2, if it's an even number, it's going to give you 0. If it's an odd number, it's going to give you something other than 0. And so that's all I'm doing there is I'm taking that value from the row number, dividing that by 2, and then saying if it's equal to 0, set the background to white. If not, set it to grey. Then for my my cell value, I'm taking the product name first. Then I'm using a format number expression. And so if you're not familiar with the format number expression, then there we go. Then the format number expression is really great. So you can pop in your number, select a specific format, and I'll explain what that means in a second, and then select your locale, which is Microsoft defined. So in terms of number format strings, there we go. So your number format strings, there's a number of different options. I'm only using 2 in this, but first we can set any currency value to a currency value, and that means it'll, when you give it the currency and the locale, it'll pop in the right currency denominator. So if I put in EN-GB, then it'll pick the pound or the sterling value. If you put in EN-US, it'll give you the dollar. France will give you the euro, Japan will give you the yen, etc. So we're able to then specify that a number is actually a currency, and then the system takes care of it for us, which is great. And then the other one that I will also be using is the percent value. So I say I want a percent, and again, put my locale in, it'll put in a decimal or a comma depending on where I am. And you can also specify if you only want to be to a certain number of decimal places if you wish to. So again, I can link to all of these elements, but I know somebody talked about the Microsoft documentation before, or looking for other sources. I find for the most part, the Microsoft documentation is excellent. It gives me a huge amount of help for when I'm trying to do things, or at least understand it, and then I can go and experiment with it. So to jump back to explain where that came from. So what we're saying here is whether price per unit, I want to format that as currency, and because I know that I'm UK based, I'm just setting the locale to be EN-GB. The quantity is just a fixed kind of integer value, so don't need to do any fancy format in there. And then our format numbers. So this one's slightly different. I'll bring back up my so what I'm saying here is the manual discount amount. I've had to put in a bit of an extra an if condition to put some controls in there. So occasionally, or quite often, you're not going to have a manual discount amount, so it'll just come back as a null value. And so if you try and put that in, it'll just end up blank. Or if you try and do a format to it and there's a null value, your format will throw an error and it'll stop working. So all I'm saying here is if the value that's returned is, if this value is null, then set it to 0, and if not, set it to the value that's actually returned, and then altogether format that as a currency. So yeah, within our kind of if we're saying if the return value is null, then set it to 0, otherwise set it to the value and then format it as currency. And that'll just help us. So if I just jump back in here, you can see all these blank spaces. I don't particularly like blank spaces. I think it always looks like something's missing, so I'd rather just have a 0 value in there, because I think one, it looks nicer, and two, it just means that it makes more sense to an end user. And then we're doing the same thing for the extended amount. We're just formatting that as currency. So what this will do is it'll run through each of the returned elements. So if I just jump back to that email, it's going to return each of these, and it'll say, is this an even row or an odd row? Let's format it with a different color so we can separate them out and make that visually easier to see. It's going to format these all as currency. It's going to pop 0 values in here as a currency, so £0, £0, £5,500, so on and so forth, and extended amounts all as pounds. So that's great. We've taken care of the table, and we'll see that in a few moments. But we still want to include all this information in the table. And so when we do that, or the way we want to do that is we're going to append a footer to it. And so if I just jump back here, what we can see is that I want all this to be on the right hand side. And if I was just to add this as HTML element, it would go in column 1 and 2, and it would look really weird. So what I want is the detail amount to span these 4 columns, and then these fixed amounts in the final column. And so we can use this HTML call span element. So call span just says, I want this value to span this many columns. So I know this is 4 columns long. So I can just say, let's set our call span to 4 for this. And I'll show you how that looks. And then I want to add the values in. So again, what you can see is I'd opened that table body up here. So I've closed the table body. I'm now moving into the footer. And again, the reason I'm doing that is just for good practice. I want to make sure that each of my elements are contained, because if I want to add additional styling further on, then I can do that. Then for my table row, I'm setting my style for this. So I want that to be a call span of 4 first of all, but I want to set the style to be right aligned. So going to here, I want this detail amount to sit over here, and then the value here to sit in the left column. I was setting it to bold for the, I want the detail amount, the pre-freight amount, and the total amount to be bolded. I want to put bigger text because they're the key bits of information, and then we're going to add these lesser bits of information. So we're going to format those slightly differently. So I'm setting that size 115%. I'm setting this big kind of top border for separation, and then you can see here I've put in the call span of 4, and then don't think so. And then we're going to format the number again as currency. We do the same for each one. For the discount, you can see we're formatting that as a percentage. Less discount again, because quite often that fixed value is going to be nothing. So we're just going to say if that's null, then set it to 0. If it's not, format as or otherwise format as currency. Again, because this is going to be our pre-freight amount, we're going to bold that up. Then set our format number to make sure it's currency. For our taxes, our freight amount, sorry, we're going to add that for shipping, and for tax amount, we'll set it as currency again. And then finally, we're going to bold up the last bit to say, gives that format number. And I've just added the compose step in here so I can see the HTML. You actually don't need this step, but it's useful for an output. And then finally, I'm going to send that email that's got the quote details. And what you can see the difference between this one and the previous one is I had to add in, if I just jump back here 1 second. In this email, I had to add this information in the bottom, but because I've already taken care of that in my append step above, I don't have to have it. It's just going to add it all to that variable. And so if we then click to test, I'll run in just a second. Excellent. And so if we look at then the advanced HTML table, what we end up with then is something that looks so much better in my experience. So, if you look at what we started with this kind of fairly simple approach, and we've ended up with something that looks really, really professional and much better styled. So we've got our kind of header in a nice block, the body in a block, and then the footer within a block. We've got alternating rows with different colors. We've got all of our values properly currency formatted. And we've got 0 values for any of the null values that were returned. We've got our percentage in. This call spans in with everything formatted right, and we can see how that looks. And so I think, and the users I test this with in my work, it looks so much better. It's much more kind of readable. I appreciate styling, probably not to everybody's taste, but I'm not, I don't do styling. So, but hopefully it gives you some ideas about what we are able to do, and with it, you can see really what the capabilities are here. Obviously, I've focused on currency values and using quotes here, but actually it's scalable across really any scenario that you can think of. And so if we jump back to the presentation one last time, I'm way ahead of time and way ahead of where I thought I'd be. So what are the pros to that? We've got significantly advanced styling options. We can combine multiple data sources. I've used 2 data sources there in terms of those quote details and the actual quote. But you could have, data from 5, 6, 7 different sources if that's what you wish to, all within the same table. The downside is obviously it's much more complicated to implement. And I guess also with that, it makes it slightly harder to maintain if you're not very clear on what you're documenting. So just as in general best practice, I'd always recommend commenting on each of your steps in your flow to make sure you're explaining what's happening there. I haven't done it in this one, so it's not great for demonstration, but just comment that out to make sure you can explain to yourself and to future users how that all works. But as long as you're following a kind of fairly robust methodology, it should be manageable to debug. And I think that's us. So like I said, I've got the link to my blog on here, and I'm happy to take any questions. My blog, like I said, it does go through it all in detail, and you can see all of the information on there. Sorry, Daniel, I'm way ahead of where I thought I'd
be. No problem. I really liked it. Let's see if we have some questions. I saw some already. Let me see. The first one was, can I save the rendering in string field to include it in model Word report? I think they want to create a Word template around that.
So I believe you can put it into a Word template, although I guess if you were doing that from CDS, you'd probably just use a Word template.
Yeah.
Because you can generate the Word template in there. It feels like a bit of a hacky workaround to generate HTML and put it in there. But there's nothing stopping you. I'd personally recommend using HTML table, or sorry, using the CDS Word templates, because that's what they're designed for.
Yeah, and if they use the Flow one or the Power Automate Word template, then they can of course do that with the table content control.
Yeah.
So that's also something that you won't use HTML for that.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would say is with the Word templates is they are somewhat limited in the sense that you can't put in place ordering for any of those repeating rows or whatever that you might have. So that's the only place you might want to think about if you're doing like sorting, filtering, or ordering. Then this is much easier because I'm sure Daniel, when you try and do the CDS Word templates with the repeating rows, it just gives you the first 100.
Yeah.
No control of that. So that's probably where this would be useful. But the styling itself, I would just leave the styling to Word, because Word's pretty much better at that, and it would make your life a lot easier.
Yeah, and I believe that if you are using it in Word documents, for instance, you could also create an HTML file first and then convert it to a PDF, I believe, or something like that.
Yeah, you could.
That's also possible. I've seen some blogs about that.
Another thing with that HTML is obviously I've used it to post it in an email, but you can see in my blog I also post it as a message in Teams. So there's lots of things you can do once you've got that HTML. You can take it and kind of put it anywhere. Obviously, the email is the kind of the standard one we fall back on, because that's stuff. But the reason I ever got into this was because anybody who's worked with Dynamics, particularly for any length of time, knows that the first thing user says is, "Oh, can you email it to me?" And personally, I hate sending emails, but that's me. Unfortunately, not everybody's on my wavelength yet. So, but when they're wanting it, I want to give them something, but I want something that is just so much easier to kind of understand, and that's kind of what led me to kind of go and explore it. I think, I'm not the first person to blog about kind of inserting a CSS style sheet. I'm sure I'm not the last either. But trying to kind of break it down and add that advanced format, I think, is really where you can kind of level up for it.
Yeah. You got a lot of good comments. So a lot of nice, looks good, great job. Looks so much better. That's something I agree with as well, because I'm that shitty at designing HTML tables.
Yeah, well, like I say, I'm not a designer, but I know what looks bad, so I can then test to see what looks good. So, but it's
Yeah.
just about, it's about playing with it, and that's where I'll pop a link to DivTable as well.
Mhm.
I find this really useful because it at least give me ideas
Yeah.
as to what you can do.
Mhm.
And like I said, the key thing to remember from here is just take out these references to dot blue table, or if you pick this one, I think it's green table or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, just take those kind of dot blue table, dot green table, whatever out, and then you can use it in. But if you are looking at that alternating rows, and that's where if we pop this horizontal stripes in, you can see it gives you this nth child even, and that just doesn't, for whatever reason, I'm not sure. It doesn't work with Outlook and it doesn't work with Teams. So
Mhm.
that's where if you're wanting these alternating rows or alternating columns, then that you'll have to kind of play with it slightly differently.
Yeah, I believe that the Teams also works with Markdown, and
Yeah,
yeah, it has different rendering options, I believe. So some Markdown clients work with HTML inside there, for instance, GitHub
yeah,
and those kinds of things. But I believe Teams doesn't do that, so that's probably why it doesn't work.
yeah.
I don't see any other questions though.
No,
So, oh, one more. Would this be something you would have to license for every user that you send an email to?
no. So you could use a service user for your flow,
Mm-hmm.
because the flow is running. It's really, and for me, like obviously I'm sending it to myself, but generally speaking, you're probably going to send this to whoever your nominated kind of customer is. You say, oh,
Mm-hmm.
the customer's kind of primary contact or something. So no, you don't have to have that kind of generated as long as you've got a service user, and if you're sending it internally, that service user has an AD account that can send emails, then it should be fine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I don't see any other questions, so I think we can leave it with that. Thanks a lot for the session. I believe a lot of people were helped with it,
Yeah.
so that's really great.